Hi everyone, good morning. Thank you for having me here at the Graphical Web. It's my first time here at this conference and really pleased to be here. Coming over here from the SVG working group from this W3C, and a lot of us are over here, so thank you for having us all. Okay. Jet Villegas, I'm Senior Engineering Manager at Mozilla. I run the web rendering on the platform team at Mozilla. And that's some of my contact information there. And at Mozilla, I run the web platform rendering, and that's HTML rendering, CSS layout, SVG, images, video, and audio. Basically, my team is responsible for the pixels go up on the screen and the sound come out of the speakers. And this month I'm celebrating 20 years in the industry. I've been at Mozilla for 3 years now, and before that I used to run the Flash player and authoring team over at Adobe. And today I'm going to talk about how I got to running web standard rendering for Mozilla, and how I got there over the last 20 years. And it was kind of a convoluted process. And it came with a lot of disruption along the way. When I say open standards, I'm referring to the standards that we talk about a lot today, HTML, CSS, etc. But the disruptive innovation I'm going to talk about is not always such a good thing. It's disruptive in that it changes the course of at the time, my business and that of others. But I'm going to talk about some key things, specifically about the graphics, that made it so that the disruption was manageable enough that I and others were able to kind of go along that vector and on to the next disruption and still maintain our innovation. So these are some key technologies that came along during that way that over the 20 years that I'll talk about. The first one is Microsoft's DOS operating system that it's pretty well documented how it disrupted the mainframe industry and made it so that we've got all these technologies available today on our desktops and eventually on phones, etc. And then I'll talk a bit about the authoring tool Macromedia Director, which circa early 90s was used a lot for interactive multimedia applications. Interactive multimedia was a term coined in the South of Market neighborhood in San Francisco, where I live, and I still live and work near there. And then they talk about some other innovations that came along, namely the desktop web, the www, etc., Web 1.0, as some people call it, that disrupted the industry that was interactive multimedia at the time, CD-ROMs and such. And then the next disruption that came along during the time when a lot of the web was text-based and static image-based was Adobe Flash. At the time that I started working on it, it was Macromedia Flash. And I'll talk a bit about that and how that was disruptive to the desktop web and how then a later innovation that came along was the mobile web, which then disrupted Adobe Flash and applications built that way. I'll go through each one and tell you a bit of a story about how I moved from one to the other and how it was necessitated and what were the things that got in the way, things that enabled the graphics to go on to the next level in these various disruptions. MS-DOS. This particular application, Yearn to Learn Peanuts, was an app that I worked on very early in my career, circa 1994. At the time, my daughter was 2 years old, needed to teach her how to read, and came across a group of people working in San Francisco on an application. They had licensed the Peanuts characters, famous Snoopy and Charlie Brown, and the content was very much for kids ages 3 to 10, so perfect for my daughter. Teach her how to read, teach her how to spell, teach her how to count, teach her how to color. Very timeless content. If you were able to pick up this, somehow load this MS-DOS application today and have a 3-year-old with a computer, they will be able to play that content, as far as playing it as a game. But you couldn't play this specific game. It was an MS-DOS app that we were working on. It was actually shipped on these 5¼ inch floppies. Anybody here ever work on software with 5¼ inch floppies? There's a few of us who've been around a bit, yeah? At the time we were working on this, there was, similar to the debates people have today about, are we going to ship an Android app or a web app or an iPhone app? It was, are we going to do 5¼ inch or 3½ inch floppies? What's the market share of each? There's similar questions. But this particular app came with 5 games, shipped on 3 of these floppy disks. So if you think about what that means today, it's, what can you really put on these floppy disks? Maybe one animated GIF of a cat, But a lot of these same tricks that people do today to get their applications running on phones were a lot of the same tricks that we were doing back in the day to make these MS-DOS apps fit on these floppies. Because an extra floppy would have cost another $1 and added more shipping cost, and a lot of things that people take for granted today, we've had to deal with them. But a key thing that was frustrating for me at the time, and it still is today, and led me on this journey, was that even though the content was timeless, Charlie Brown and Snoopy and that song that we all hear when we think about that at Christmas, timeless content, teaching kids how to read, timeless content, and yet how we delivered them on these floppy disks was not timeless. In fact, today you can't play the game. But there were key things between these technologies that went from, say, MS-DOS and then onto the next technologies I'll talk about, that made the transition possible as far as the graphics were concerned, because the Charlie Schultz Peanuts characters were drawn by hand with pen and ink and used very few colors in the palette. And index palette images were the key innovation that made it so that we could at least get that stuff out of these floppy disk games and on to the next thing. And I'll talk about Macromedia Director in a moment. But index palette images, you see here this image of this bird is actually, looks like a full color image, but it's actually only made up with fewer than 256 colors. And that optimization made it so that we could fit a lot of these images, namely the Peanuts gang, with very few colors. In fact, I believe we were able to do it with 218 and render the whole set of Peanuts characters. And we were able to take those same images and get them out onto the next media that we would use to make the next games that we were doing. Interestingly enough, this particular innovation, the tagged images with index palettes, remains in use to this day. The most popular is the GIF file format that we know for rendering cats and such on the web. And it was good enough and still good enough for that particular use case. And its longevity made it so that it's ubiquitous, available on a lot of platforms still to this day. In fact, the most popular video codec on the web is GIF89. No audio, horrendous compression, but still the most popular on the web today. Go figure, right? It functions well enough for the purpose and gets the job done, and it makes it so that the cat images from the CompuServe days back in the day you can still enjoy to this day. So as an example of an innovation that made a disruption manageable enough to take you to the next level. At the time that interactive multimedia was becoming the catchphrase in the San Francisco area where I lived, authoring tools were coming around that enabled the easier authoring of this content. The first game I showed you earlier, the Peanuts game, was a DOS game written in C, and it had a bunch of proprietary hooks to render the graphics. It was quite convoluted. And over time, it became easier to render to author these games using in this case the tool called Macromedia Director. Again, developed in San Francisco by a company called Macromind at the time. Macromedia was the collection of different companies that merged to become Macromedia. It was Authorware, Macromind, and there's another company, it escapes me now, a 3D authoring tool. But some other games that I worked on at the time were a continuation of the same licensed cartoon characters for kids, the Snoopy Gang and the Flintstones. Again, the content was very timeless. You teach mathematics, teach spelling, teach, in this case, more spelling, but with using the Flintstones characters. And now it became easier to author more of these things. And it became more accessible for a lot more people to join that revolution of storytelling, games, interactivity, using now new tooling. And I'll show the early interface of Macromedia Director here. And a lot of these, of the tooling, still, you can see these elements today in authoring tools used for interactive media. You'll see a library or a cast view of assets, a stage where you would render the actual content, tools for drawing, a score and a timeline of sorts for layering content, an inspector user interface that you can change the properties of things over time, animation effects at the lower right here for color cycling, fading in and out, simple transitions. But this particular tool was quite innovative at the time, where a lot of these concepts weren't in wide use. And yet it managed to be accessible enough so that the disruption of CD-ROMs in that time, and now before we had to ship things on floppy disks, all of a sudden we had all this room on the CD-ROM, 640 megabytes. And if you look at again, the content that was being created at the time, using Director, again, timeless content, now new authoring tools, but still, when the web came along, you couldn't view that content. The Macromedia at the time shipped was the beginning of making plugins for the web so that you can view this content. But it was content written for CD-ROMs. It wasn't going to go over those 14.4K modems, and it was still quite a breach to reach with this. So again, I've got a lot of content suitable for all time, right? People love the Flintstones, till forever, and the Snoopy Gang, and yet can't get that stuff over to the web. Another disruption comes along, can't bring the stuff over, even despite tooling that was available. So at the time, people still wanted animated content on the web, and Macromedia, at the time the company that makes Director, was very keen to play in that space. They knew that their days were numbered. The CD-ROM sales were going down, web content was going up, and they went around to the usual suspects, Disney, the big Hollywood studios, to show Director and say, we've got a web plugin, and you can have your animated content available on the web this way using Director. They go from place to place to place, and one of the places they went to was Disney. And Disney at the time was using a plugin on the front page of their website for games and such called Future Splash. It was developed by this small company in San Diego, 3 guys working on it, called Future Splash. And it was small and fast enough. It was vector graphics that they were, Disney took a risk of putting plug-in content on the front page. It was compelling enough to, that the Disney characters moving around was a compelling enough use case that they allowed the Future Splash plugin on their website. Macromedia at the time, caught wind of this, and they decided to acquire the Future Splash product and rename it Flash, Macromedia Flash at the time. Interesting bit about Macromedia Flash was that it was initially an authoring tool, a drawing app, before it was a web plugin. And a lot of the things that were developed using that technology were primarily for fast vector graphics on the web, similar to what we use SVG for today. But that was what it was, is main niche. Fast vector graphics, which was over modems specifically, faster to send down small binary files with vector data than it was to send large bitmaps. which at the time were either JPEG or GIF. And we saw that earlier today at the Maps talk, how you send vector graphics down, which is actually faster, but people want to see things quickly. And a lot of those same tricks people were doing at the time in their early websites using Macromedia Flash. And you see some of the content that people used Flash for. Cartoons like Strong Bad. The initial YouTube player was using the Flash player, and games like Farmville. Popular content used that was using Flash. And at the time, this was very disruptive. Even at the time, I'd started working at Macromedia. You spend enough time in the South Market area using the tools. Eventually, you get good enough at it that you start making the thing. And at the time that Macromedia picked up the Flash product, there was real concern with their cash cow, which was Director at the time, the other product I showed you earlier, that it was going to cannibalize on Director sales. And there was a real desire to not do that. People are hesitant to lose their livelihood. And so there was a real desire to see if we can just weld Flash into Director, keep the same user interface, keep the same revenue stream, and somehow output vector graphics. But I think one of the best decisions they made was not to do that, to not actually try and keep this cash cow going, but to cut it at that point and actually be very specialized for small web graphics, which I think made it so that Flash became very popular at the time, because it was very ubiquitous and it was a small enough plugin, and Netscape invented the plugin interface NP API that made that possible. IE eventually did ActiveX and made it possible there. And then once you've got Mac and Windows going and Linux going, then you've got something, right? And then your web graphics and audio started to become viable on the web. I'll show a bit of the user interface for Flash at the time. Eventually, Adobe picked up Macromedia, largely so that they could pick up Flash. And here's some of the user interface that Flash used. See some of the familiar elements that were either borrowed or directly ripped off of Director. The library UI, the timeline up above, the property inspector, the tools. Again, quite disruptive to get from CD-ROM authoring to web graphics, but there's enough there to bring people along. And that's the key to the disruption, so that it doesn't jack people up, right? Is that you can somehow bring people along, just like the index palette graphics brings MS-DOS games onto Windows, and then the user interface brings Director people onto Flash. Eventually, Flash sales outstripped Director sales, and I started working on Flash. At the time, I was one of the programmers working on it. And eventually, stay there long enough, you eventually start running the place. My peer programmers decided when we were interviewing for an engineering manager, they said, "Why don't you sit in the chair?" And I'm still sitting in the chair. But that was again a key innovation that disruptive, but wasn't so disruptive that it alienated everyone. I think about these, we talk about self-driving cars now as possibly a disruptive innovation coming around, where if you think about really disruptive innovation, we were already promised flying cars by now, right? But you can't lay that on people. You got to give them self-driving cars first, and kind of move them along that continuum. And that's similar to how Adobe Flash did that for multimedia authors at the time. So that leads me over to open standards, and the next innovation, disruptive innovation that came along, a few years ago was the mobile web. The iPhone ships, and Steve Jobs, writes a letter to the planet, says, at this Adobe Flash, we're not having it. It's not going to be on the phones. If you guys want to have that stuff, it's going to be using the technologies that we'll make available to you. Quite a wake-up call at Adobe. To say that before, if you wanted the whole web, you had to have Flash. That was just kind of a no-brainer. You know, imagine people to this day are still running code I wrote. You know, unless you're the small percentage of the population that doesn't play games or watch pornography on the web. Raise your hand. No, don't raise your hand. But you know, it's still in wide use today. But you know, it was a wake-up call that if you're going to have it run on the phones, you're going to have to find something else. And for me personally, I saw that writing on the wall right around then. You know, I've been, even when I was working at Adobe on Flash, I'd been hearing the Flash is dead call over many years. You know, SVG is going to take it over, HTML5 is taking it over. But right around the time that the iPhone shipped, those calls were coming from within the company. Before it was people from outside, and we'd just, you know, we'd ship more features, and we'd just keep on going. But it became clear that it was on to the next thing. And again, I find myself with a bunch of content. In this case, you know, working on Adobe Flash, authoring tool, and the Flash player, with a bunch of content that people have authored, and again, no way to bring them to the next level. If you wanted to get your Flash content to the web, you'd have to rewrite it in Canvas or HTML or something else, or turn it into video or what have you. But it's a problem that you know, it's still something I'm trying to solve. I still want to get, you know, from the very start of my career, getting the kids' games over to wherever the next thing is. It's still a problem I'm still solving to this day. But now I'm thinking, you know, I've been at it 20 years. Now I'm going to solve it for the last time. Right? Whatever I'm going to work on next is going to outlive me. And hopefully, right? I mean, that's a bet. And I'm betting on open standards, and so is Mozilla. And that's why I find myself working at Mozilla now. When I was working on Flash, I had to work with all the browser companies, because you know, Flash works on all the browsers. But I found that Mozilla was closest to working on open standards and getting things going so that they will outlive us all, you know, a web for all time. And so again, you know, my group works on HTML, CSS, SVG, the images, video, and audio. And another project that we're working on, again, you know, in service of what I was talking about, getting people from the last disruption on to the next, is a project called Shumway. We are implementing a Flash player in JavaScript and HTML. And why are we doing that? Isn't that just kind of a crutch for people to keep using their tools for web content? It's many things. It's primarily a need we have at Mozilla to offer a Flash player, because people still want that content, and do it in a way that's secure and fast, and that will work on the devices that don't have a Flash player, namely Firefox OS devices. We also wanted to take an inventory of our technology stack, the HTML, the CSS, the SVG. Can it actually do everything Steve Jobs promised? We said, you know, no more Flash, you're going to do it this way. But is that true? You know, or is that marketing hype? So how do we actually know? Well, we're going to use that same browser stack to render Flash content without a Flash player. And anything we're missing, we're going to build. And let me do a quick demo here. Let me show you some of that. This is a game called Mushroomer. It's a 2D Flash game. You'll note here that I'm going to right-click on this just to show that it's not Flash. You know, you normally see the Adobe Flash Player update and the other controls that you'd see there. But this is not a game that we ported to HTML5. We didn't go and take the game source and rewrite it in JavaScript and Canvas, though people do that. This implementation actually takes the original content, a Shockwave Flash format, .swf file, parses it in the browser, and renders it using HTML Canvas and the JavaScript implementation of Flash that we are developing at Mozilla. Familiar loading Flash player thing. Okay, start playing the game here. So you have familiar gameplay, all the controls work. it's a little chunky on this system because I'm running a bunch of different things here to run the presentation also. But it works pretty well. You know, we get, in this case, 24 frames a second, which is what the game was authored for. And you know, just keep playing it. But the key thing here is that it wasn't, again, you know, it wasn't reauthored for HTML5. We took the original content and started running it. If for whatever, let's say the Snoopy games I had, if they were Flash-based, they'd start working in Shumway without me having to reauthor that content. Again, the goal here is to see if the browser stack, you know, this Shumway runs in Chrome, it runs in IE, and Safari, if it's mature enough to render all that content. And we've found that it wasn't. You know, we've had to add things to the browser standards to enable the use cases that Flash was used for. Graphic filters in Canvas is one that we're standardizing now. Events so that we can get you know, the game events over, pointer lock and such. You know, we're standardizing, working with Adobe on some of those things like the filters, working with Google on some of the others. You know, for this to work, it can't be just Mozilla's thing. You know, otherwise you're stuck again with a single vendor doing something that eventually will become obsolete, and then you're stuck trying to rewrite your content again. And so you know, that's the quick demo. We're still iterating on this one, but the goal here is that we'll eventually be rendering Flash content in Firefox using JavaScript and HTML. Similar to how we do today, our PDF rendering for Adobe Acrobat files uses JavaScript and HTML to do that. That's the demo. And we have a website, areweflashyet.com, that you can check out you can see the sources and participate if you'd like, see how we do it. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing in HTML that also we've taken a cue from the earlier technologies I talked about. Today we're working on vertical text in HTML. When I was working on Flash, we shipped vertical text sometime in 2006. But to have text that goes up and down, primary use case here is Japanese and Chinese newspapers, but you can think of others, you know, having maps that read this way or table headers that go that way. A lot of use cases that you know, we think vertical text will enable. Again, this is one we're standardizing with others at the W3C, and you'll see that in other browsers as well, but in Firefox in the coming months. That's vertical text in HTML. In CSS, this is you know, the filters we were talking about earlier, drop shadow, blur, and others that you know, Chrome already ships this one. There's a bunch of other browsers that implement this also. But again, you know, these are some of the things that we shipped in Flash Player circa 2008. You know, we can pick and choose some of these things that were once only in proprietary technologies and bring them over to the open web, hopefully, you know, so that they can continue on, you know, beyond the time that, you know, I'm no longer working on it, and the stuff still works. So that's something going on with CSS and a number of other things too. CSS working group at the W3C is very active, and the Chrome guys are in there with us, and the Safari guys and the IE guys. Yeah, CSS has legs. It will definitely be a technology to bet on and continue on. SVG, there'll be a much more detailed talk from Brian Birtles on SVG and animation, web animations that I won't go into too much detail, but he will, about some of the things that, again, were only available before in technologies like Flash, you know, very, very accurate time controls and seeking, being able to control the animation clock in different ways. And we're looking to have that be a common web animations system for both CSS animations and SVG animations. So Brian will go into quite a bit more detail there at his talk. Don't miss that one. And then technologies for gaming that you know, the WebGL and Asm.js that we're working on. Also at Mozilla, WebGL is available in I believe all the browsers now except for Safari, but I think that's coming around. And then Asm.js is a subset of JavaScript that we are working on to enable very fast programming for this kind of 3D gaming. Again, something that shipped circa Flash Player 11, now available on the open web. So really excited about that. Again, more technologies that were once only available proprietary. Hopefully, you can author your content using these technologies, and they will live on. Again, last time I want to do it. And then I'm running out of time here, but I want to talk about audio and video a little bit. Some of the things that we're working on, again, with the other browser vendors for standardized web audio, induced synthesizers and other effects that you could do in Flash before. Media source extensions is a way to have control over the video and audio stream so that you can have adaptive bitrate and other tricks that people can use so that their content can adapt with limited bandwidth and have be able to inject content into an existing stream. YouTube is going to be using that, and we're moving away from Flash, and they'll be using media source extensions available on the open web again. Encrypted media extensions, a key use case that Flash is still used for today is premium video, the DRM as you call it. It's controversial that people still want it, but people want to get paid for their video. Can't argue with that. Encrypted media extensions coming to the open web. And another thing we're working on at Mozilla is an open source codec called DALA, a next generation codec that we hope will become a standard for web video that supports very low bitrate mobile video all the way to 4K, very rich high density video using a patent-free, royalty-free codec there called DALA that we're working on. So to summarize, I'm at time here, but to summarize some of the key success factors that I've seen coming of these disruptions that actually stand the test of time and become lasting innovations beyond specific technologies that brought the disruption. Authoring tools, being able to author these things using tools and not have to handwrite them and rewrite them all the time. Runtime ubiquity from multiple vendors. So having a single vendor, whether it's a big one like Adobe or Microsoft, but having that available everywhere from multiple vendors gives you that insurance that your content will live on. And again, Mozilla is betting on open source as a way to guarantee that runtime ubiquity. Another key thing that I saw over the years is strong data types versus containers, and I'll talk to this for a moment. HTML is kind of a hybrid of both, where it's a data type by itself. You can have your tags in HTML. It's also a container. You can bring in images and such into that format. But for graphics formats, the ones that I've seen stand the test of time are the ones that are strongly typed. GIF is a strong data type. It doesn't contain content from elsewhere. It's self-contained. It will survive going from network to network to network without degrading. And it's makes it easy for tools and for runtimes to parse. And it tends to stand the test of time longer than things that contain other things. For example, the Swift file format, which is a strong data type, but it's also a container for other things, whether it's MP3 or video, and things like that tend to fragment, and they don't survive moving from networks very easily. So that's a point that I've seen over the years. Small and fast is also something that seems to keep coming back. I was working on floppy disks, and then CD-ROMs, unlimited room, and then back to the web, there's no room, and then Flash, and then back to the mobile web, where it's small and fast keeps coming back. So if you had a choice between slow and big, small and fast, bet on small and fast. And then optimizing for specific use cases. The technologies that are supposed to be the end-all and be-all for any use case, any application, those are the things that tend to eventually fade away. But a graphics format for dancing cats, those are that's use cases that are optimized for that particular format or technology. Those tend to stick around because they work well enough for that purpose, and people will keep using something that works well enough over something new that might be sketchy or require more tooling or whatever. So some key success factors I've seen over the years. So thanks. I think that's time. Again, that's me, Jet Villegas at Mozilla. This is my website. If you guys have to take a look at some of the things I blog about, and Jungle Code on Twitter. Hit me up and keep talking. Thank you.
Thanks, Jet. Might have time for just one or two maybe very quick questions if anyone has anything they'd like to ask. No takers? Oh, one taker.
Hi, I'm Cameron McCormack. You're my boss.
Okay, go easy. Just throw me a softball, Cam.
This is not the main question. So your mention of Macromedia Director reminded me that in the early 90s when I was still at high school, we used to play around with Asymmetrics Toolbook, which was a Windows-based CD-ROM multimedia authoring tool. And it was quite a useful tool. It had like a simple scripting language, lots of GUI drag and drop stuff to produce multimedia content. And I guess the next evolution of that was the Adobe authoring tools that produce that sort of thing. But whereas the browser technologies, these graphics technologies that have become available like on the open web, open source projects, the authoring side of things hasn't really got there, at least for open source tools. And I think one of the key good things about the open web is that for viewing stuff, you can do it for free. Maybe some commercial programs might be better, maybe not. But on the authoring side, the real quality applications still seem to be commercial ones. So I wonder whether you have any views on why it might be that open source authoring tools for those kind of multimedia applications haven't really improved along with the implementations.
Yeah, I know what you mean by that, and I'm a little saddened actually at the state of things, and I'm trying to encourage that. I do believe that there is a place for very high quality authoring tools to be open source and available, and we're seeing some of that already. Adobe is making some open source technologies as a basis for their authoring tools. They're the Edge tools, for example, or brackets that they're doing out in the open. So I'm encouraged by that. And I think part of it is that there's an expectation in authoring tools where you have WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get authoring. That's kind of a standard thing when you're doing authoring. But the other standard thing that is very difficult to implement is round tripping, such that you can edit something in the authoring tool and go back and change it later, and your changes will take effect. For things on the open web where you can edit things by hand using a text editor as well as an authoring tool, it breaks a lot of that. We could do it in Flash because it's a binary file format we understood. We do it in Director because, again, a binary file format we can understand. With file formats where you can throw in the text from Moby Dick into the middle of a text stream, and the authoring tool parser has to somehow build a UI around that. It's a very difficult kind of problem. But it's not something that's, but it's not impossible. I think it really needs done. But it's really hard work. I'm seeing some of that coming around. But I think that there really is a need there, and there's actually a commercial opportunity for that. I think people can really, for all these technologies we're doing for rendering and runtime, that the authoring tools haven't come up. I think is an actual opportunity for someone or for a group of people to, get paid doing.